Good evening and welcome to Burlington City Arts, to the BCA Center. It's a delight to have you with us tonight. And also our virtual audience, which keeps growing in numbers. I always say to people, I'm the director of Burlington City Arts. My name's Doreen Kraft, and I always say that come out and be live with artists because there's nothing like it. It's so fantastic to be in the presence of the person who has created this work and is here to share with you their ideas and thoughts. But that's okay. The comfort of your home, sitting around a cozy fire and listening to the conversation, it's second best, but it's still great. So welcome to everybody. I am very pleased as the director to welcome Sarah Stefana Smith with us tonight. Thank you for coming, for driving to this marvelous place called Vermont and being with us another evening. And to Heather Ferrell, our curator, who put this marvelous exhibition together and brings such good ideas and such great artists to Burlington and to Vermont for conversations that don't happen any other place but here. So welcome, enjoy the evening, and thank you both for everything that you do for our community.
Welcome, everyone. And I thought because we have a hybrid event tonight, we should make a few format announcements and then go into introductions before we start our conversation. And first off, we have a last minute schedule change, and regrettably, Anya Wallace could not join us tonight. We missed you, Anya, but hopefully we can have you up for a future program. But we are very pleased to have you here tonight, Sarah, and have this conversation. And conversations like this, hybrid events, it's always good to kind of go over a few items. So for those of us who are joining us via Zoom, please use your Q&A feature for Zoom to pose questions. And what we'll ask you, though, for the audience here live as well as hybrid, is to save those questions until we run through a series of sort of back and forth with our conversation, and probably about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up to everyone on Zoom and here in person as well. There is a reminder I always like to put out there that you are being recorded, and we will hopefully make this available in the next week for not only Sarah, but the community to enjoy and share. And let's jump right in. And I think my next thing is Willful Matters. Hopefully you've had a chance to see the exhibition in person, or if not, you can see it as part of our 3D gallery tour on our website. But in Willful Matters, Sarah Stefana Smith combines materiality, aesthetics, Black art and culture, and queer theory in different bodies of work that interrogate identity, including her series Flags to the Abyss and Asymmetries, Symmetries, which we will discuss further tonight. This imagery is provocative, it is contemplative, and it really challenges us as viewers to consider all these intersecting ideas and how the lines that demarcate difference, race, gender, sexuality, may constitute and establish belonging. It's really been a pleasure working with Sarah since I think the fall of 2019, where I had the opportunity to go to Rutland, Vermont for the 77 art residency program and meet Sarah there, and had an amazing conversation. And from there got very excited to present Sarah's work here in Burlington. There was that small matter of a pandemic that slightly delayed our project. But what is also thoughtful and as an opportunity in a way is that your work really kind of progressed and went in a couple of different new directions that for me as a curator, especially a contemporary art curator, it's fascinating. You literally see it as you move along in an exciting new direction. And I always love to be the first to show that to the community. So I will just share a brief bio, but it's so helpful to understand really, your accomplishments and also just so much of what informs your work. Sarah Stefana Smith aesthetically and critically contributes to discourses on Black culture, queer theory, affect studies, and visual and aesthetic interpretation. Smith's work has been exhibited extensively, including shows at the Arlington Arts Center in Virginia, the DC Arts Center, Washington, D.C., Gallery CA, Baltimore, Maryland, and the 20-year retrospective of A Different Eye. Cystography celebrates 20 years of photography, an Atlanta-based photography collective of African-American women. They have published in the Black Scholar Journal, Women in Performance, Drain Journal of Art and Culture, and in Ruptures, Anti-Colonial and Anti-Racist Feminist Theorizing, among other publications. Smith has participated in numerous residencies, including Creativities Project, University of Pittsburgh, Meriwether District AIR, Columbia, Maryland, 77 Arts here in Rutland, Vermont, as well as the Vermont Studio Center, receiving the John Pavlis Fellowship. Sarah received a PhD in social justice education, the University of Toronto, Canada, an MFA in interdisciplinary art at Goddard College, Vermont, and a BA in sociology and anthropology from Spelman College in Georgia. Currently, Smith is assistant professor of gender studies at Mount Holyoke College, lecturing on gender and visual culture, transnational feminism, and Black art and culture. Thank you for joining us here today.
I think this is on. Yep, it is. Hi. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
So this is a conversation.
It is a conversation.
And but it's always nice. It's always nice to start a conversation with just like, why are we here? The exhibition, Willful Matters. And I thought maybe you could just introduce what's going on in this exhibition. Just kind of give us a quick overview.
Yeah, I am going to highlight that I am a note taker. So I have my phone here with my talking points because I appreciate an outline and a framework. And I might be reading from them in some ways, but I kind of would start with this idea that Willful Matters sort of brings together a constellation of things that I've been thinking about with materials. And I think about materials both as the tangible kinds of things that I'm working with in the work, and then also sort of the thought process that's happening. I think maybe kind of beginning with the title, this idea of willful and matter sort of speaks to a kind of relational concept that I'm interested in. So this is where I'm going to read. One of the things that I sometimes do as a process of kind of coming to an understanding around materials and matter is I look up words for what they mean. And so with willful, its definition is an immoral or illegal act or omission. It's intentional, it's deliberate, and it's having or showing a stubborn and a determined intention to do as one wants, regardless of the consequences or the effects. And so I chose part of this framework, particularly because everything that I do very explicitly is about Black life and Black life form, particularly when one has to sort of negotiate kind of histories of power. That this sort of notion of willfulness kind of complicates that when you're sort of thinking kind of questions around race and gender. And simultaneously, because I am someone that is really interested in materials, I quite literally like to touch and engage materials to see how they shift their function and the ways in which they become something totally different. There's this kind of juxtaposition between the use of material and idea and experience as a way of it both mattering and being a kind of deliberate kind of act of, I think, disruption towards what it sort of articulates itself to be. So as a way of me being less abstract, the work itself kind of brings together three bodies of work, a series of objects that I make called flags, and then two bodies of work that are sort of photographs and kind of sculptural collage assemblages. So this would be an example of the object, and then there's also kind of works on paper that move between photographs and these sort of sculptural collage assemblages. And they are in many ways an invitation to sort of think about relation and non-relation. That's kind of the through line of the entire sort of corpus of this work. And I guess the other meaningful thing that I would want to sort of point to, I keep sort of talking around this idea of material and mattering, and that is that one of the core materials that I engage with is bird netting. It's something that you can get from a Home Depot's and a Lowe's. Some of you probably have seen it because people put it on bushes and stuff to keep deer and birds from eating crops. It also sort of extends to these sort of materials that look like nets and grids. And so why bird netting sort of matters to me is first because I had this experience of living in a high rise where people would put bird netting on their balconies to keep pigeons from sort of nesting on their balconies. So it was sort of this material that I mean, it was literally a barrier, and my experience of encountering it was that, oh, wow, this is like conceptually heavy and complicated, and the material would also hold light in really weird ways. So for example, if the sun would hit it, it would kind of go transparent. You wouldn't see it. And there are ways that it also sort of takes on kind of other visual cues. So it comes in black, white, and green. And sometimes it looks like lace. Sometimes it looks like a lot of different things. So what does it mean to sort of negotiate a material that is both grotesque and violent and fraught and beautiful in a certain kind of way, and use that as a kind of mechanism to think about really big issues, concerns, and questions. And so I think that this show for me has really been about kind of negotiating that relationship between questions of life, questions of sort of violence, in a way that is also sort of abstracted so that it invites a conversation with a lot of people.
And that's interesting because every time we talk about the materiality and how it's sort of a framework for these larger, deeper conceptual ideas, but are also everyday ideas that you're living with, nuances come out. And I'm just for everyone here, it sounds like this netting is something that is, in your work. It's like you said, a through line over several years. I mean, or does it just kind of pop up in certain projects, or you just kind of return to it? I'm not.
I certainly return to it. It's really, I think when I first sort of started using the material, so that story of me sort of seeing it in the high rise, I was in grad school, and that probably would have been about 2012. So I've been playing with this material for 10 years. And I think I initially sort of began with a kind of obsession with the material. I was like photographing it. There are a couple of works in there where you can kind of see examples of that, but I was photographing it. I was making objects. I think when I was at the Rutland residency, I was working with plaster and trying to sort of build out sort of bigger objects with netting, and it's kind of morphed into it becoming more about a concept where I don't necessarily have to rely on the netting itself to do a certain kind of work, though it's in all of the work. So in flags, if you look closely, there are parts of it where you can see netting that I've used a spinning wheel to turn into kind of craft yarn. And then I also start incorporating other kinds of materials, like there's rope, there's paracord, there's even and then there's sort of found nets, like volleyball nets and pickleball nets, which are in mad surplus when people get rid of it. So then it gets to sort of be incorporated into the work. And so I think kind of to your question, what happens is I'm more interested in the network, like how the the netting becomes an opportunity to think about networks between people, place, difference, species. And I use this term relation and non-relation because I quite literally mean the way people, place, space relate and non-relate, and how that has sort of happened and been negotiated over time when we have to kind of contend with a historical present and then work that into sort of forms of contemplation and connection now. I quite literally mean relationship. Like, what does it mean to sort of develop relationship? And that's what I think the bird netting does, but then I get to kind of think about it more conceptually. So a good example would be some of the sculptural collages, which totally, I think kind of, at least in my mind, sometimes I think these things work really well and they don't always work for others, but you know, that's why you have conversations. But with the sort of the sculptural collages, I call them sculptural collages because I think it really is about kind of texture and touch and feel, and but there's not an explicit sort of site or reference point, but there are elements of it that I think kind of speak to relationships, symmetrical and asymmetrical, within the composition. So I'm using sort of pieces of collage, pieces of photograph, pieces of netting in relation and in not relation to each other within the kind of within the composition.
And
yeah.
And especially like with that series, I mean, is that something that you'll work on and come back to, or is it just like different iterations? Or could you talk a little bit more about that process of developing these relations and non-relations?
I would kind of say like a lot of my process is through repetition and serialization. So one of the things that you'll kind of notice in the way that I title the work, whether it's the flags or symmetries, asymmetries, is everything's about like number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I don't think that this is particularly unique to me. I know artists do these kinds of things, but I really actually think about serialization and repetition as an act, as a process of revision and a re-invitation and a discomfort and the actual process of returning to something over and over and over and over and over and over and over. It's kind of an obsession, but it's also, I think it's a kind of mechanism for doing a difficult kind of work, doing a difficult kind of work that might sort of visually shift over time. I mean, like some of the folks that I think about in terms of like artists that are, I mean, one of the people I've sort of thought about a little bit have been Agnes Martin. And these paintings and drawings that she does of just lines and grids over time, over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And there's a sort of interior heaviness that I think about in relation to that, that's subtle and like shifts over time. And so I think when I this relationship between repetition and serialization is really both a working through for me and a kind of a very process driven way of thinking about nuance and thinking about small shifts over time in the practice. This is a really roundabout way of me saying that you probably will see many more iterations of the same work. Like another example is I just installed another show, which was a reinstallation of an installation that I had done back in 2019 when I was at Merriweather, which I grew up in Columbia, Maryland. So there's a whole other process of me reinstalling a work in order to revisit a set of questions and work through kinds of ambivalences that, you know, that I'm kind of negotiating around home.
And where is the show? Tell us a little bit more.
Oh, okay, cool. Great opportunity. So it's up through March. It's in Northampton at a gallery called APE Gallery. It's a group show with 2 other artists, Alex Callender and Wendell White. Wendell White is a photographer. Alex works in drawing and painting, and the show is called After Archives. So it's curated by Amy Halliday. And part of the relationship between that show is that each of us sort of are engaging with archives in a particular kind of way. The work that I have in that show is engaging with a kind of public archive by the developer James Rouse, who was instrumental in envisioning Columbia, Maryland in the 1960s. It was actually a project of kind of responding to urban sprawl, but one of the other sort of tenets was about Kira. That's my very good friend. I'm just gonna say hi to her because why not?
You think that seems so front?
It was one of the other sort of goals of Columbia was to integrate people based on race and class. And what's interesting about that place, I sort of inherited that history. I grew up there in the early 90s. So by the time I did that residency in 2019, it was the 50-year anniversary. And again, these things are not lost on me. There's something pretty significant about getting to return to a place. Home has a lot of, I think people probably negotiate complicated feelings around home. And I would say that one of the things that I was negotiating around growing up in Columbia was how successful it was. Was it as successful in sort of addressing that kind of vision? So that installation was really about thinking about how space, urban design, histories of Black people within that area impact and shape contemporary ways that we understand space now and contemporary ways that we might understand belonging. I would say to a lesser extent within this show, there are archives that I'm sort of thinking about, though it might mean that we think about archives a little different.
Like personal archives.
Yeah.
Could you tell us, kind of
Yeah.
going back to
Yeah.
the sculptural drawings?
Yeah.
I don't know if everyone would realize some of those personal archives that are in there.
Maybe I need to think about that a little bit.
Well, in terms of
like you
going
haven't thought
back,
about
sometimes going back to your own work
Yeah.
and looking at it and then collaging it back
Okay.
in.
Yeah, for sure. Certainly with like some of the collages. So one of the things that I do is all of the work that I do, the installations, and I take pictures of them. So oftentimes I will photograph the objects at residencies and in process, and then these sort of macro images will then become parts of the projection in the installation, and they'll also become parts of the material that I collage into the works. And part of that process is, I think in many ways it kind of speaks to this circular revision, this sort of constant sort of circular conversation that I think I'm having with myself and others, which I guess could sort of speak to a kind of personal sort of archive. I kind of think I need to think about that a little bit more, but I do think that there is an element of it that has to do with me sort of negotiating what happens as an artist making the work and then sharing it in a really public sort of way, and then having conversations with people that then sort of kind of influence or I resist in certain kinds of ways, or that sort of shore up ways that I'm thinking about the work, and then kind of incorporating that back into that kind of conversation. So maybe in a way, the sort of personal archive is about these points of contact, these points of relation and relating and non-relating that I guess are sort of ongoing processes.
And that's what curators do. We like throw these new ideas out because I think of it too, like with artists and looking back at your practice and how artists look at their practice or revisit ideas is really fascinating, because for me, it's a type of kind of like a creative archive. But I know I'm using it as a curatorial term, but I love this idea that you're always actively going back to these ideas, re-exploring them, building upon them. And I thought that would be a nice segue to talk about the Flag to the Abyss series, which is which I have to say, like, this was like not even a year that you've been working. It was kind of a new direction. And then you started showing the like process images, and I got really, really excited. And but anyway, tell us more.
Yeah. So I think I produced the first, so there's 4. I produced the first in, I want to say 2020. And I knew that I wanted to make more. I kind of put parameters around, I put sort of structural parameters around how I make work in order to like not get overly hype and then like move all over the place. Sometimes it becomes a way for me to sort of like do things a whole bunch and exhaust it, and then sort of kind of shift the process. And so part of that has been the use and the absence of color: white, black, green. The introduction of green sort of became possible when I had a conversation with a fellow artist, and she was curating a show, Alicia Pillar, a show that I was a part of, called Radical Dawn. And really that show was about thinking about, you know, a kind of futurity. And so there was this conversation we were sort of having, and she was sort of like, I'd like you to think about the green. Maybe that can sort of help mobilize this sort of idea of futurity. And it just sort of worked. And so, but the Flag to the Abyss sort of became, it kind of started in a couple of different ways. Heather mentioned that I by profession, I'm an academic. And so one of the other things that I'm doing on a regular basis, and this is not to say artists don't do this, I'm not saying that, but I'm reading a lot and I'm teaching the things that I'm reading and having those conversations with students. And so I've been reading Edouard Glissant. He's a Caribbean scholar who wrote a book called Poetics of Relation. I mean, I'm thinking about his methodology of relation in that text. It's very much something that I'm negotiating. And so these Flags to the Abyss are really a conversation that I think I'm having with him. It's also a conversation that I'm having with some of the other folks that I list on the back of the it's kind of a little bibliography. Evelyn Hammonds is another person who sort of wrote an article that's inviting us to think about ways in which Black femme subjectivities have been under theorized within sort of Black studies and queer theory. And she's problematizing that. I think it was written in like the 90s. And then she talks about the Black hole. And so the Black hole, there's this line in the article where she's talking about the Black hole or the void from someone looking out doesn't look like anything's in there. But when you are actually in that space, it's all of this matter, all of the world's matter. So there's this sort of like interest that I have with, and I am a humanities-based person, but also an interest in kind of how we even understand matter in the universe. And so this relationship between Glissant, who's thinking about relation through poetry and poetics, relation from the site of the Caribbean and the archipelago, the island, and also from the site of the abyss kind of being another way for us to think about the Middle Passage and histories of transatlantic slavery. And so I'm thinking about those things. I'm thinking about the conceptual weight of bird netting. And I'm like, I want to make really big things. Let me, learn how to weave, look at the ways people use knots, macrame. I'm going to make a huge wall loom. And then I started doing that. And it was sort of a very organic process. I am not someone who was like super like measured, it's kind of like, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to go over here and try this. And I think I sort of generated a methodology that is both, I think it's important to sort of say that it's both kind of coming in exponentially from myself, but it is always in conversation with so many people, so many thinkers. I mean, Anya Wallace's work, she is really mobilizing this idea of Black hole theory in her own work around Black girlhood, pleasure, and abolition. And I've been fortunate to talk to her about those things. And so I think all of this is me sort of like problematizing relation, and then doing it in a way that's both a manifestation of an actual art object. I also want to just sort of shout out my students, because I totally told them to come to this talk. Intro to Gender Studies and Black Sexual Economy students, because they're some of the folks that are reading these things with me, and then they're encountering these pieces of reading for the first or maybe second time, and then we're talking about it, and we're trying to make sense of it in the context of very specific kinds of curricular concerns. So yeah, a flag to the abyss. I kind of feel like it's sort of like it's like me saying to you, this is my syllabus. This is how these are the things we're reading and looking at and thinking about. And then these are the things that we're making together. So the flag to the abyss in many ways is that sort of, it's a methodology and a way for me to sort of make sense of you know, folks who I'm really indebted to, folks who I'm really thinking about sort of within my academic sort of work, and then producing a sort of a kind of visual language to be in conversation with that. I will also say, because I didn't say this, the last thing that I wanted to sort of point to is that one of the reasons why I'm thinking of them as flags to the abyss is also this sort of the challenge of even the challenge and the problem of claiming a territory, the problem of naming something a territory, and then the challenge of sort of even naming or marking a territory of something that has to be imagined. And so I think that has also been kind of a part of this sort of process, making an object that's both tangible, but is also about a relationship or a set of relationships that still require a sort of imagination.
That's excellent. And I'm just, and for me, I go back to, you know, you're working through all of these things, but even just as the visitor who comes in to see the show, I mean, they're really struck, as I am, by all of the work and how it talks to one another, I should say, as separate, but also as an installation, and as something that is just so original, like in a way that I haven't seen anything like that before. And I'm immediately drawn to it. And then I stay. I kind of follow those relationships and those patterns. And I thought it'd be interesting, before we maybe turn the time over for questions, just to talk about this installation here at BCA, and just how you maybe saw your work in a new or different way, or maybe where you might be going.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's like a two-parter.
Sorry.
So I think the first part, I think that this experience sort of definitely when we were installing, talking with you and Jackie and sort of trying to think, part of the conversation was I wanted there to be a relationship between these three bodies of work. And that was just really important to me. It was important to me that there could be interaction and conversation that were happening between the flags and between the sculptural collages and some of the photographs that could be subtle and nuanced, but also obvious enough to see that kind of relationship. And you know, I had not, I really think the show has sort of visualized that relationship in really sort of explicit, tangible ways. It's also made it possible for me to make more of the flags through the sort of commission aspect. And then I think this sort of like segues into sort of where I'm headed. And that is, this is not over. I think that, as I've sort of said, I work in serialization, so I'll probably have hundreds of this. I mean, I definitely want to make more of the flags, and there's some ideas that I have. I'm thinking about incorporating indigo and natural dyes and different kinds of conversations that might sort of emerge in relation to that. So I think that that's a big sort of component in terms of what's happening next. I think this other piece is that there's still this sort of through line that's around networks and relationship, but I'm also very interested in archives and sort of bolstering that. So there's this, me working with the archive of growing up in Columbia, Maryland, me working with some of the archive. One of the first conversations we had sort of had was in Rutland, there's a major stone quarry, and I think a school that works in stone sculpture. And so one of on Main Street, I saw a stone sculpture that was honoring the 54th Massachusetts infantry, which was one of the first infantries during the Civil War to integrate African Americans. And so I've been working with the Boston Athenaeum and the Massachusetts Historical Society, looking at some of their materials around war and care. And specifically, I'm looking at kind of Civil War era nurses and soldiers. And I'm trying to kind of make sense of that and problematize that in relation to, the emergence of the US as a nation state, what that means for empire and war, and how that implicates people into that. So I see connections to this a kind of willful mattering, to return to the title of the show. I certainly see ways in which different kinds of material get to become sort of in my hands, the site for me to think through a kind of rigorous curiosity around a historical past and the way that it has everything to do with the present and what that actually offers, what it means to live now.
It's wonderful, wonderful stated.
Yeah.
We'd love to open it up for questions now from anyone. And Sarah Jane is going to help us pass the mic around because we are on Zoom and recording. Thank you, Sarah Jane. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Jackie.
We both sort of talked a little bit about material sculpture.
Yeah.
And I'd love to hear more about your inclinations when it comes to material combinations, because there are so many textural differences going on.
Yeah.
It would be great to hear more about structure and how you approach those sort of material unifications.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And certainly it would come from someone that is also a sculptor. So I appreciate that. I think some of the ways that I come to material is that I'm just curious about it and I want to push its boundaries. I also am very aware of a relationship to fear that's associated with it. And what I mean by that is sometimes there are materials that feel less accessible because of positionality. There are already some sort of built-in ways that my technical, what I know, what I've learned doesn't always feel like it aligns. And so it becomes this sort of opportunity for me to sort of expose that and explore that. So let me give you an example. In the After Archive show that I just reinstalled, it includes these sort of forms that are made out of steel and these sort of soft textural weaving pieces. And I think you can see it in this show also through the sort of ready-made kind of beams that are used for the flags, the kind of metal, and then these sort of softer kind of some organic, some human-made plastic, etc. materials that show up. And even materials that have very explicit utilitarian functions. Like, what does it mean for me to use bird netting that literally comes from Home Depot and Lowe's, and in a real obvious way, these are very gendered spaces. In a less obvious way, they are also there are ways that I think the story of artists, of contemporary artists, of modern artists, are often associated with certain kinds of materials. So the material combination for me, I think, is about pushing at that all the time to the best of my capacity, even if it means like recognizing, I mean, one of the things that I'm learning as an artist that gets to make more and more work is you don't do this stuff by yourself. You just don't. And this whole idea of a lone artist, I mean, yeah, but also no. Like, like you literally don't. There are people that help you install the work. There are people that have skill sets that like help you learn things. I learned how to weave on a table loom because I was working with a master weaver, and she only showed me two types of like patterns for weaving, so I could do a kind of loose weave, and I love them. They're absolutely beautiful, but also that's a little sliver of this sort of practice. And I had to do that in order to also really appreciate the amount of labor. Like, it is physical. It is physical, y'all. You have to it was like I was needling 200 eyes of needles twice just to set up the loom. And then there's a particular colonial history to this. And I think that that's what materials tell us. I can talk about bird netting as being sort of the dominion of white men. I mean, it's a human-made material. It's plastic. It comes from a Home Depot. There's a whole generation of artists that buy materials from Home Depots and make work. And so then what does it mean for it to also get to be a space that I make things out of? And I get to own that. And I think I'm probably going to misquote, but I'm going to totally give it to Frantz Fanon, because I think he had something like, he was sort of talking about, I am all of the world's history. And the way that I understand that sort of quotation is that I get to own a lineage of things that might not necessarily seem like they're necessarily associated with histories of me or others that might be like me or what have you. And I get to own that. Maybe own is not the right word, but I get to utilize that to imagine other kinds of ways. So I think the kernel of this relationship between material juxtapositions is that absolutely, yeah, material juxtapositions. I am going to juxtapose soft, sort of embodied kinds of materials with these hard forms. And I don't think I'm the only person that has ever done that, but I'm totally gonna talk about it in that way. And I can do that and acknowledge that it both exceeds my skill set, and there are people that have been really helpful. I mean, I was working with one of my colleagues and fellow artist, Dixon Williams, who works wonderfully with art and technology to do a projection, because it exceeded some of my skills for the moment, but it also made it possible for me to put together a kind of concept and to work in collaboration with someone. So those are some of my thoughts about sculpture and material. Yes. And craft is practice, like is a kind. I think I'm also interested in disrupting that kind of relationship. That's such an old conversation, y'all. Come on. Like, yeah.
Any other questions in our audience, Doreen?
Sarah, in talking about that conversation that you are invoking or provoking in the work, there's inherent conflict.
Sure.
So, and you refer to the rejection in an earlier point of some of the response that you get. What is your process for how you hear or incorporate or reject those other voices?
Yeah. A lot of feelings. But also, I mean, I am often in a classroom where we are negotiating where we are, if that makes sense. So I say that to then say that I think there are like things that I practice as a educator and a facilitator that perhaps help me kind of create distance and space while simultaneously trying to practice acts of self-care, because some of it can be microaggressions too, and like very real kinds of things. But I think there's another sort of component to your question, which is what do I do with sort of like ways that the work might get taken up that are sort of out of my control, and what am I thinking about in relation to audience? And I mean, I think that there are things that are really sort of helpful to that. I'm interested in the conversation. My work is about Black life, but there is a reason why I'm less interested in using figuration and representation, because now I think it creates opportunities where the work doesn't sort of like parade in a certain kind of way that for me creates some capaciousness, I guess, that I'm feeling like I need. And then I also think that there's an element of it where there's a kind of confidence about what the work does and a meaningfulness that I am comfortable with standing by, because I do my research and I know what I'm talking about. And I am also open to lines of inquiry around that. And so if those can be the conditions of points of contact, I think critique of the work or differing views or differing sort of points of view or outright hostility, there are ways that I think that equips me to sort of be able to negotiate. And then also kind of like, I think there's extremes to this also, to sort of be like, I'm gonna redirect and stay on message because this is what I'm interested in having a sort of conversation with. And then there are like ways where there's an invitation for discussion. In many ways, I kind of think this comes back to sort of a conceptual scaffolding with the work, and that is me literally talking about relation and non-relation, and many points of contact, even on the level of audience, are not about relation. And so there's no working around that. And yet there are many invitations where points of relation can be made possible, even as I'm interested in directing the conversation in a certain way. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you talk about your use of color, and particularly the green that has come in to some of the work?
Yeah. Some of this has been about me sort of very explicitly working with bird netting, and that it literally only comes in these sort of 3 colors if I get it as bird netting. Of course, nets come in a lot of different ways, and that I think is where I will probably expand. The use of green, I think, was sort of easy to sort of come by because it has this relationship between the organic and growth and plant life. And there are elements of it where I'm thinking about it in terms of a kind of contagion or a sort of spread, or we could think about it in terms of mushrooms, like that sort of spread underground, or the roots of trees. And so there are associations, I think, with green that are really sort of obvious that I think I'm leaning into. in relation to that. I think there are also some sort of subtle components, like, we could think about money and consumerism in relation to green, and I am using bird netting, and it is a human-made sort of material. It is a consumable kind of material. There are plastics and a number of other sort of components that are a part of it. Green shows up in the installation in relation in subtle ways to Columbia, Maryland. One of the things and people will most know about Columbia is there's a huge mall there that is like shenanigans of malls. Like, it's huge and it's transformed and it's weird. So there's green, but I also think with black and white, which is sort of, they're on these sort of continuums of being all color. And is that right? Is that like all of color and none of color? I think that is certainly where I was initially sort of thinking about it. I was also thinking about artists that think about that as a sort of formal way of talking about race and racial formation, like Glenn Ligon's those textual paintings that he's done where you can't see the lettering because there's this sort of, it's opaque. There's certainly those kinds of references that are sort of playing out. In terms of where I think I'm headed with color, I'm interested in moving into blues and oranges for a number of reasons. Nets show up as orange. And I've been thinking about construction nets, and I've been thinking about the scaffolding of buildings that use different kinds of netting. Sometimes I forgot what it's called, but it's to keep debris from like falling on people. And so there's a kind of industrial sort of built environment component that I'm really interested in with nets and the use of color and its relationship to color. And then there's also these sort of traditions of color. I'm thinking of green and indigo as sort of early dyeing processes. And if we are thinking about parts of, the Caribbean and other areas where there were whole plantations, around hand-dyed materials that people couldn't get off their hands, and those kinds of uses. I even sort of appreciate your question because it invites me to sort of think about how I would be interested in mobilizing color, which is that color is never outside of a sort of political framework, even if we have certain kinds of associations. Those are the things that are interesting to me and are certainly the ways that I would be compelled to expand my color field. It's coming. It's totally coming. Yeah. Thank you.
You said earlier that your three bodies of work were having a conversation with each other. Because I like to anthropomorphize everything, I had this vision of the lights go down and everybody leaves and your art starts talking to each other, literally. I was just wondering what you think they would say.
Oh, that's such a lovely question. Because I often think about the table and the conversation, the kitchen table, or it comes up in gender studies. What would they say to each other? I feel like I'm gonna project myself on the conversation, but wow. And I'm also a little stumped. My first thought, as someone who, this is my first solo show too, so this is the first time that I'm seeing a significant amount of work in conversation with each other. And so, I'm kind of excited about it because it really lands to me. To me, it does. I can actually see the connections. And so I think that maybe the kinds of conversations that the flags might be having to these small drawings are sort of like, maybe it's like inner child work where they're sort of like, I remember you as, this sort of like, you were the sketch vision, even if it's not an explicit sketch of the thing. There are little kind of elements where, that show up in the drawings. So the sort of ways that I'm trying to kind of make marks that sort of create the void within the net, and how that shows up in I think it's flag number 2 or 3 with the white with the green, where it's sort of 2 parts, and so there's the void in the middle, and then there's sort of these other sort of components, where there are sort of like, oh, I see a glimmer of how you have allowed me to become the thing that I am. That's the kind of conversation that I think they might be having with themselves. Some of them might also be like, I should be bigger in size or scale, or like, and how can that happen? But that might be my desire, or I should be smaller to really ask people to get really close. Yeah. I'm gonna think about that though. It's gonna keep happening. I'm gonna keep thinking about that.
You mentioned relational grid, and I'm curious to hear more about that. I think the only place I've ever heard anything similar was in Octavia Butler's work. I think it's Seed to Harvest, that where she talks about relational grids and
Ooh.
yeah. Have you read that?
So I've read the book,
I think
but now I'm gonna
I think it's
look for relational grids.
the 3rd book in the I think it's that one.
Okay.
In that series. But I'm just curious, like my mind has been stuck on that since you had talked about it at the beginning.
So
and I'm just curious if you can say more about that and how it informs your work.
So I was turning on my phone so that I could remind myself to go back to the 3rd book and Seed to Harvest to look for relational grid. So maybe you'll remind me so I don't forget. I love that. So I think some of the ways that I'm thinking about it, like grids aren't just symmetrical lines. And here's a way that I would sort of answer this sort of question. I often, and I think my students will probably say this a lot, that I often say entanglements in the class. I'm always talking about entanglements. And I think when I'm thinking about relational grids, I'm thinking about the mess of entanglement, and it quite literally shows up in the materials that I'm using. It gets caught on me, it gets caught on the things that I make. And so the putting relation and grid together, I think on first blush it might seem like those things are kind of harmonious, but they're not necessarily harmonious, because grids can be entanglements onto themselves. This is going to be a huge detour, but I'm just going to sort of say it because this is what I think I'm having in association with it. But some of the things I've also been thinking about are surface and depth, this is not my idea, but many folks have written about this in relation to, if you were to like fold a piece of paper, what becomes the surface, what becomes the depth. And so I think this relationship, engaging this idea of the grid, is in many ways a conversation around depth and surface, which is also a conversation about interior and exterior, which is also a conversation about entanglement and mesh, and whatever would be the opposite. And I'm trying to not say grids, because I think the first visual that comes up is just sort of like a flat plane with lines versus something that is entangled onto itself. This is also a question I'm going to be thinking about because I think I'm kind of being windy, and now I'm probably going to go to Queen Octavia Butler to see what she was sort of thinking about this, and then I'm going to look up everybody that talks about grids in relation to just sort of be like, thank you for that. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And as we are doing thank yous, I want to be sure that we thank so many of the people and sponsors that help make programs and exhibitions such as Willful Matters possible. My first shout out would be to BCA's communications and events team for helping bring this event out to the community. So appreciate all of you, and also to our curatorial team and our Zoom mistress Jackie and Sarah Jane, our microphone mistress. But also it's a big team here at BCA, all of us coming together to make exhibitions happen. So thank you all. And I also like to thank really important sponsors for our exhibition series, including Mascoma Bank, the presenters of our 2023 exhibition year, the Maslow Family Foundation, the Vermont Arts Council, and the National Endowment for Arts. Really, they have been wonderful in supporting all of our exhibitions and programs. But I want to end with one last amazing thank you to you, Sarah, because we are so fortunate to have you here tonight, but also the exhibition all the way through until May. So everyone, I hope you'll come back and tell your friends. Thank you.